Hello, BookTube. All right, we're barreling along at our 12.2K Q&A, and we're up to part 3. We're up to Chris Bianchi. Do you have favorite book by Luigi Pirandello? No. What starter book would you recommend on the history of Sicily? Nothing comes to mind. Not history. Travel guides, yeah, but not history. What are your thoughts on Elfried Jelinek book, The Piano Teacher? I think I read The Piano Teacher. It's not making a strong impression. We're not doing well for your questions here. And number 4, what's your favorite work by Ronald Furbank? He seems largely forgotten. Yeah, he's completely forgotten. I don't have a favorite work by it, but I thought that's a clean sweep. That's a clean sweep of questions that I could not engage with. And that starts off part 3. We're doomed. Let's just move on. Julie Alvar says, "Hi, Steve. You mentioned on one of your library tours of the Lost the book called The Court of the Lion by Eleanor Cooney. And Robert Altieri was her co-writer? It is described as the third book of a trilogy." I think I remember that it was, but it doesn't feel that way at all. Do I need to start with the first book? I was thinking Court of the Lion would be a good mammoth for March. Well, I didn't start with the first book, and I loved Court of the Lion. I vaguely remember now that it is not the first book in the series, but I didn't notice at all. You could definitely use it as a mammoth for March of the Mammoths, but where would you find a copy? I guess maybe I haven't looked around. Maybe online there are copies that you can get. Let's see here. Bass Van Dyke says, number 1, as a fan of Lord of the Rings, what are your thoughts on the Silmarillion? It's spotty. I've done some read-alongs on the Silmarillion. It's uneven, of course. It was never meant to be one narrative reading experience like Lord of the Rings. But the parts of it that are great are very great. So you have to sift around a little. And I've known people who found parts of the Silmarillion fantastic that I hated. So I think it's a treasure trove. Number 2, I think you mentioned that you consider audiobooks not a real form of reading. Is this also true when someone is reading to you in real life? Well, like I mentioned, I think we need a new word for what we're talking about here. Listening to an audiobook is not reading a book, obviously. I don't know why I get pushback on that. That's not an opinion. That's not me criticizing one or the other. It's not the same thing because it's a different thing. It's like driving a car and playing tennis. They're not the same thing. There's no way even metaphorically that you can say it. It's a totally different thing that you're doing. You are still consuming a book, but that's it. That's the commonality. It doesn't go any further than that. You're not reading a book if someone's reading it to you. The same thing is true if someone reads to me in real life. That doesn't happen, first of all. But if it did, it'd be a social thing. It'd be a communal thing, but it wouldn't be reading. Anyway, PHXSNS1 says, number 1, what do you think of, or dare I ask, have you read John Graves' Goodbye to a River? It seems right up your alley, and not just because his dog appears throughout. I vaguely remember it. If I ever read it front to back, I need to read it again because it's not. If I possessed it as a reading experience, then it would be right at my fingertips now when you mention it, and it's not doing that. So maybe I read about it, maybe I read reviews of it, or maybe I started it and didn't finish it, or maybe I read it and made no impression on me, but I don't have enough of it. I don't have it at my fingertips enough to talk about it. And number 2, how do you like East Texas? Any favorite towns or spots? I love East Texas. I lived in Texas and went everywhere in the state, which is a lot because it's a world on its own. It's a whole country on its own. In East Texas, I of course mention Tyler, Texas. In season, Tyler, Texas for the garden shows and rose shows that they put on, just amazing, just incredible stuff. I don't usually go in for that sort of thing, but nobody does better than Tyler, so I strongly recommend that. Nick Piccarilli says, number 1, who was the most interesting author to do an event at Barnes & Noble while you worked there? Depends on what you mean by interesting. Interesting in the event they gave, or interesting in the communications that we had between the two of us that weren't part of the event? I have an infinite number of author stories from Barnes & Noble, from face mooching with Martha Stewart's dogs, who she insisted that they come to the event with her, but they couldn't be at the table with her. So her handlers were told, you can bring these back all the way across the store to the receiving area, and they can wait there until the event is over. And I was crossing the store while they were being escorted back there, and I immediately started burbling, and they immediately started bouncing up and down on their leashes. And one of Martha Stewart's creatures said, well, they're not they're not friendly to strangers. Sorry. And I said, I mean, I didn't say anything because by then I was already squatting down and we were already face smooching. So if you haven't face smooched with a dog until you face smooch with a very pampered chow chow. It's all face. but also, in terms of most interesting, once upon a time, a long time ago, George Takei wrote a book. Mr. Sulu from Star Trek wrote a book and came to the store to give a reading, and conversation ensued. Private conversation ensued that was probably one of the most interesting things that I've done, although things like that happen for a lot of authors. So those two come to mind, one dogs and one Mr. Sulu. And number two, you mentioned watching The Tragedy of Macbeth recently. Are you a fan of any other Coen Brothers movies? Not usually. No, and I was expecting them to do all sorts of Coen Brothers crap in this Macbeth thing, and they do very little of it. Or maybe it suits them. Maybe the Coen Brothers' usual shtick works well with Shakespeare. But not usually, no. A surprised number of people have heard me say, you really should watch this, and said, what? You like this? Same thing with is it Look Up? I love that movie. I've seen it 4 times now. And people say the same thing to me. They say, this is a Leonardo DiCaprio movie. You can't like it, but I do. I do very much. Sean Moriarty says, can you recommend a good biography on Tolstoy other than Rosamund Barrett's, if there is one? There are a few. Troyat wrote a really good big book, a biography on Tolstoy. And also, much as I don't like the author, A.N. Wilson's biography of Tolstoy did really well for him. It sold really well, and it is a really good biography of Tolstoy. So I can recommend that as well. Harrison Recht says, number 1, did you by chance see the film Victoria and Abdul with Judi Dench? If so, what did you think? I saw it and loved it. Number 2, the only thing I didn't like about it was its characterization of Bertie, of the future King Edward. I guess the producers thought the movie needs a villain, and he'll be it, and that's ridiculous. The Bertie who's in that movie is unrecognizable. Just a ridiculous character, nothing like the real thing at all. When the villain in the movie, if the director and the showrunners had the courage for their convictions, the villain in the movie is time. There are some scenes in it where that is explicitly nodded to. That should have been good enough. You don't need an actual villain, but beside from that, I loved it. Number 2, am I wrong in thinking the novel Dr. Zhivago is mostly poorly done with some scattered effective passages? Are you mad? Are you mad? Be gentle. My primary love is nonfiction, but I love much of classic Russian literature. There's one piece of classic Russian literature they apparently don't love. Mostly poorly done? Good Lord, man. All right. Grania C says, hi, Steve. Would you please recommend travel writing of Italy and or Greece? Well, that's a whole video on its own. I mean, Italy, I'd strongly recommend Italian Days by Barbara Grizzuti Harrison. It's a fantastic book. I don't know if it's still in print, but there are a long list for both that I would do that I can't do in a Q&A. Lisa Garrity says, there have been several science fiction TV series lately based on books. Yes. What books have been overlooked that would make great TV shows? Oh, God. Again, a long, long list of them. There's a long list of them that would make for great adaptations, provided you have the right people doing it. From classic works, like the Farford and Grey Mouser series, or even Dragon Riders of Pern, all the way to more recent stuff. I'm sure that Hollywood is paying attention. There's lots of stuff to adapt. That's a whole list on its own, books that need adaptation. Kat Ballou says, I noticed you rightly pointed out the hideous covers of 2021 releases in America. Why do people insist on putting hideous covers on their books? I don't think they insist on it so much as that I think most books are given virtually no budget for their book art. I think it's one of the last things that's thought of. So I think the people involved are basically told, make do with what you have on the tabletop right now, but don't do anything expensive. Don't add to the overhead of this book. And if they're told that, then what they produce will come down to creativity. Simple as that. And I don't notice a whole lot of that, not just in 2021, but in the last 50 years in American book design. William S. says, what do you think of William Empson, both his poetry and his literary criticism? I like literary criticism more than the poetry, but I think both share the same turgidity. And what do you think of the poet Michael Donoghue? Don't know this poet well enough to talk about. And lastly, where do you go to college if there's any scholarly consensus? There is no scholarly consensus on the subject. There are 4 or 5 institutions vying for that honor. Maximus Stedich says, what scholarly and intellectual merit do you give to Ken Wilber? His work intrigues me, and I'm interested in your bare assessment. I've only tried one of his books, and it seemed to me to be arrant nonsense. And to such a degree that I haven't been really intrigued enough to try others. I should. I forget the name of the one that I read, but it seemed just ridiculous. Maybe that is probably a bad assessment. I don't mean that to be definitive. I need to go back to this author if people are taking him seriously. Let's see here. Alan Black says, what is your opinion on Boris Johnson's Jimmy Savile scandal and the mob attack on Keir Starmer? For those of you who are not up on your British politics, they have a thing that America would never in a million years do, Prime Minister's Questions, where the Prime Minister actually fends off criticism in real time, on his feet, with no teleprompter. He's got his front bench of supporters behind him, but his opposition has a front bench of supporters too, and they can wail away. As long as they don't make any personal implications, they can wail away on policy. And the prime ministers, it's fascinating watching to do. They have to think on their feet to a certain extent. Unthinkable that would happen in American politics. Just unthinkable. But in one of those recent sessions, Sir Keir Starmer is the leader of the opposition. It's his job to criticize Boris Johnson, and God knows there's a lot to criticize, what with the arrant failure, just this ongoing scandal of more and more evidence coming forward, that while Boris Johnson was imposing strict rules for COVID on the country, he was ignoring those rules himself. So people couldn't exercise, they couldn't go out in public, they couldn't see their friends, they couldn't go to the hospital with their relatives while he was having parties. That has now become an open, ongoing scandal, and Sir Keir Starmer has been hammering away at him for that, and a number of other things, but mainly that. And in one recent session, it's horrifying even to remember it. In an act of pure Trumpist desperation, Boris Johnson mentioned Jimmy Savile, who was a beloved entertainment figure in British history, recent British entertainment history, who was then later found to be a monstrous predator, a monstrous pedophilic predator, just a horrible aberration of a human being. And that has been very embarrassing for all sorts of establishment figures who were cuddled up with him, or were close to him, who fundraised with him, did jokes with him, showed up on shows of his and joked around with him. The implication being they all had to know what he was. It was an open secret, so to speak. And there was nothing legal that was done against him in his own lifetime. And part of the establishment legal end that didn't do anything had as one of its employees Sir Keir Starmer at the time. And in a desperate ploy to change the conversation, recently Boris Johnson mentioned that in Parliament. He explicitly connected Keir Starmer with Jimmy Savile, the Jimmy Savile scandal. For some reason, the Speaker did not slap that down. That absolutely should have been slapped down. Boris Johnson should have been told, you're not welcome in this House until you apologize and retract that statement. It's monstrous. What you've just done is monstrous. And it had the absolutely predictable result. Sir Keir Starmer was out in public and he was mobbed. Had to be escorted by security. People yelling out the name Jimmy Savile. Totally non-factual. Boris Johnson did that because he had the power to do that. It was the same thing as Donald Trump pointing at the reporters in the back of an event at one of his Klan rallies and calling them the enemy of the people. It's going to have the totally predictable result. Again, a little disappointing how many different aspects of the British political commentariat have gone out of their way to say, well, I don't know that we can attribute that, the mob violence, to what Boris Johnson said. No one was mobbing Keir Starmer before he said that. And then people did it after that. So he is responsible. Oh, hi, baby. Oh, are you a Tory supporter? Is that why you're trying to get me to calm down? I think it's disgraceful, is what I'm trying to say. Trish Boville says, you often say you got into reading late. When and how did you get into reading? I had one key teacher, showed me how wonderful it was and encouraged me to do it. And that's what did it. J. Scott Phillips says, I've often heard you refer to our little corner of BookTube, and I've assumed you meant a small group of influencers, you being the sexiest. Why, thank you. It's just good that you said that, so I didn't have to call you on it. With whom you sometimes co-host, share content, and otherwise embrace in your commentary. Or is it something more or less when compared to all of BookTube in general? Well, it's more than that. There are plenty of people that wouldn't come on my channel that I still champion. But it's definitely drawn in contrast to the bigger booktube channels, the big, glitzy, hyper-sponsored, totally fake booktube channels that I'm sure you know. I'm sure that they're in some of your feeds, and that they are every bit as phony as I'm sure your instincts tell you they are. They don't read. They don't care about reading. They never sit quietly with their phone off. They don't do anything like that. Instead, they're just in it for leveraging it for easy money. They have a passive income stream. They make a couple of videos a month, and they have a passive income stream from people who call them a reading guru. There's nothing heartfelt. There's nothing genuine or one-to-one about any of that larger booktube ecosystem. And that heartfelt thing is present here in probably 250 channels that are not in it for the money. Although quite a few of them, even though they say they're not in it for the money, have still appended commercials to their videos. They'll go out of their way to tell you, it's just pennies. It doesn't make me any money at all. Well, and I always want to say, well, if that's the case, then why are you making me sit through a mattress commercial to listen to your opinions? Why are you doing that if it makes you no money? It's just this response in Americans that if there's a way for something to generate money, even if it's a penny, well, then I'll do that because I don't have any control. It's like some sort of a galvanic response. Just because there's a potential there doesn't mean you should do it. Especially annoying. There are 4 or 5 booktube channels that do that. They're small, and yet they have monetized their channels. They have ads in the middle or at the front or at the end. It's just that's annoying enough. It's even more annoying when they say, well, I'm giving that money to charity. No, you're not. You're funneling that money to charity, but if you were giving money to charity, it'd be your own money that you were giving. You're not giving your own money. You're giving my money to charity. And if it's a pittance, what charity wants a pittance? But I'm referring to a very much smaller grouping of booktubers. Faisal Hadi says, one of your fans from Kuwait. I have a question. Thumbs up for Kuwait. Number 1, my question is, do you know anyone who reads more than you do? I don't at the moment, no. Number 2, may you mention books that refute Noam Chomsky's ideas? Which ideas? Does he have many people who refute his ideas about linguistics? I don't know how respected he is in the field of linguistics these days. I think it's pretty easy to come up with refutations of a lot of his major talking points from 40 years ago. Just by watching I'm sure all of his speeches are on YouTube. I'm sure every burp he's ever done is on YouTube. It's not hard. You don't need a book to come up with refutations of a lot of them. It is my main problem with his worldview is that it's intensely religious. It's intensely Nicomachean. If your worldview says that there is one black and white monstrous supervillain that never does anything good and always does the worst thing possible at all times, then you have a religious worldview. And I lose patience with the reductive simplicity of religious worldviews. And that is very much his worldview. Number 3, do you like Warren Mosler's books? I don't think I know that name. Warren Mosler? I don't think I know that name. I think I'll wait for 12.3K Q&A for the rest of my questions. So let's see here. How are we doing for time? All right, let's press on here. Mike Kreese says, what are your thoughts on Calvin and Hobbes? It's great. Absolutely great. What are your thoughts on the life and death of Conan? What about your all-time favorite Conan story? The Life and Death of Conan, I haven't read the whole thing. I've read it in its installments as a comic book. Sometimes my reactions to those things change when I read them as a whole thing. It had really great moments, the comic books that I read. But I really need to get, I'm sure it's been collected, I really need to get that collection and read it through. My dogs Magnus and Wolfgang give their regards. Well, my regards right back to them. They're my babies. They're my babies. Maximus Stettich says, do you know any good nonfiction books that examine the jet set age of the 20th century? I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I'd need more specifics even to guess. Chris T says, do you know how to play any musical instrument? No. What is your favorite sitcom? Oh, God. It would be a top 10 list. I imagine for sheer, repeatable, visceral enjoyment, probably Frasier, but it could be The Simpsons, or it would be a list. It wouldn't be one show. What do you think of Terry Pratchett? He comes up all the time on these Q&As. I don't love him as much as his superfans do. I don't think there's much there, but I love watching how much his superfans love him, so I get that out of it anyway. When you were traveling the world, how did you fund your travels? I had money. Do you have any recommendations for how a young person could see a lot of the world on not necessarily a lot of money? I think it's hugely expensive nowadays. I imagine it can be done. My advice would be look up shoestring or budget travel on YouTube. There are people who have YouTube channels. That's all they do. That's their source of income. Is you, the clicks, the revenue, and they are often full of advice on how to do that. I think one of the ways, not necessarily a lot of money, would be to gradually, over the course of a small amount of time, weatherize and equip a van so that you can live in it, and then travel with that van. So you're traveling with your hotel. I think that's probably one of the ways in this country anyway. In this country, there's a lot to see. That might be one of the ways, but it's still a startup cost. How are we doing for time? All right, we're fine. Let's see here. Jenny Parks says, number 1, Max Brooks has now done zombies and Bigfoot. What do you think he should do next? UFOs. Without a doubt, UFOs. Number 2, do you think all Shakespeare adaptations should be done in Old English, or is modernization okay? Well, modernization of setting or... you want to come down, baby? There you go. Modernization of setting or plot, or modernization of setting or costume is fine. Changing the language is not fine. Absolutely not fine. Number 3, do you have any tips on DNFing? I feel like I'm allowing a book to defeat me. DNFing, for those of you who are new to the BookTube ecosystem, means do not finish. It means dropping a book. And you shouldn't think of a book as defeating you. If you are seriously tempted to DNF a book, then you're defeating the book. The book is failing you. It's the book's job to make it so that you never think about that. If you do think about that, then the book is failing on some level. So don't beat yourself up. That's my job. James Holder says, what genres are the Brattles strong on and which genres are they weak on? They tend to be, well, they're really strong on the mainstream stuff. Mainstream fiction, mainstream history. They tend to be a little bit weak on the genres, but it's not a systematic thing. It's not an ideological thing. It's totally dependent on their buys. They're not buying all the time. If they find a bunch of stuff, if it's a very good year for mystery acquisitions, then suddenly they'll be very strong in mystery. There's no ideology that's imposed. Do you have any active writing projects besides reviews? Not at the moment. No, I really should. I should be writing fiction all year round, but I don't at the moment, no. Gunnar says, what's your opinion of Anne Seeger's Seventh Cross? I haven't read it. Do you like the retelling of Orlando Furioso by Italo Calvino? Not particularly, no. BJ Minton says, what languages do you speak and or read? Again, I mentioned this in an earlier version of this Q&A. The standard Romance languages I can read and speak. Speaking if I'm around speakers, but reading is not a problem for the standard Romance languages plus Latin and Greek. Have you hiked any parts of the Appalachian Trail? If so, which parts? Oh, you underestimate me, mes amis. No, I have indeed hiked all parts of the Appalachian Trail. In fact, I am probably the only person who you will ever listen to who has hiked the entire Appalachian Trail without provender. But that was a long time ago. Those days are long gone. I'll never set foot on the Appalachian Trail again, and that is very strange. Chris T. says, I had written before about Australian books. I wonder if you could give a brief opinion on, and then he lists a bunch of people. Patrick White, obviously widely regarded as Australia's greatest writer. I need to go back and reread some big things. Thomas Keneally, everything I've read has been very good. Peter Carey, same thing, very strong writer. Christina Stead, my favorite of them all. I love Christina Stead's work. Bryce Courtenay, what little of it you can find in this country other than The Power of One. I've read all the books that I get in this country and have loved them all. They've all been really good, although none as good as The Power of One. Tim Winton has never really done it for me. I should keep trying. Manning Clark, is that For the Term of His Natural Life? Is that author? I don't know that I know that name. Donald Horn, I don't know at all. Henry Lawson, I don't know at all. Banjo Patterson, I not only don't know, but don't believe. I don't believe there is such an author as Banjo Patterson. Let's see here. Frederick says, thoughts on Black Mischief and Evelyn Waugh generally. I love Evelyn Waugh generally, and I like Black Mischief. Thoughts on Confession of a Shopaholic and the Shopaholic series? Oh my, I read the first book because every customer coming through the door was asking for it. Thought it was very, very thin stuff, and it has stayed thin. I read, I think, one other book, and then okay, I get it. And there's nothing else here to get, and I get what you're doing. Thoughts on H.W. Jansen and his History of Art. His History of Art is really, really good. It's very, very dry, but it is complete. It is comprehensive. I see it all the time at the Brattle, and I'm always tempted to get it, but I know that it would just gather dust here. Thoughts on Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? A perfect example of the adaptation of a book being much, much better than the book. Thoughts on A.L. Rouse and his annotated Shakespeare. It's very, very good. It's A.L. Rouse doing his bit, so it's the Donniest of Oxford Dons, just sort of lecturing you about Shakespeare. No possibility of misinterpretation, no possibility of other interpretations, no possibility of doubt, even when the material is wrong. But it is a feat. It really is. If I came across his annotated Shakespeare at the Brattle, I would grab it. Thoughts on made-for-television movie The Naked Civil Servant starring John Hurt as Quentin Crisp? Don't think I've seen it. Lastly, I believe you once said that if you ever revealed your political ideological position that people would think you were joking, or something to that effect. Are you a monarchist? If so, what variety? Absolute, constitutional, thoughts on monarchism. Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do, is talk personal politics online, on YouTube. That's exactly what I'm going to do. What a great idea. Let's see here. John Petter says, given your interest in conspiracy, could you weigh in on the origin of the virus? I don't know if it'll get this video pulled or blocked by YouTube, but I think there's a very strong reason to wonder whether or not this thing escaped from a laboratory. I haven't heard much on that subject recently. I think people are just done with the virus. They don't want to even think about where it comes from. But to me, a lot of what I'm seeing when I see actual scientific breakdowns of this virus don't look natural. But even if they did, the origin story, I think you'd be crazy to just completely dismiss the idea that this escaped from a laboratory where it had been worked on, where gain-of-function research had been done on it. I don't think you can easily dismiss that, but I don't know. I am waiting for books on the subject. All right, we're almost at 30 minutes, but we're almost also at the end of these questions, so we're going to just push on to the end here. Chrisam70 says, what is a good introduction to Roman history, literature, poetry, etc.? Do you have an intro canon for Rome? Well, obviously I can't do a long list of every aspect, a good introduction to every aspect of Roman life and history. There are a whole bunch of good starting points. The first place that I would always recommend would be Wikipedia, or some online encyclopedia site, or something like that, romanhistory.org, or something like that. Get an overview first without investing in a book or an author or viewpoint or anything like that. Get a few viewpoints until you're relatively conversant in the overall big picture, and then dive in, whatever interests you the most. Ranch Elder says, which ancient historian boasts the harshest ratio of modern readership to historical importance? Apart from the lost works such as Asinius Pollio, perhaps Diodorus Siculus. I don't know. I don't know. My first response would be Livy, but for different reasons. Let's see here. Faisal Hadi says, may you recommend books on Malcolm X? Yeah, I do, including one from, I think, last year or just the year before. The title was The Dead Are Rising. Fantastic. It's an endeavor. It's a big book, but it was fantastic. Angie Jones says, do you have a particular way to celebrate when you meet a punishing deadline? You're looking at it. I did in years past. I had all sorts of other ways. I would write a snail mail letter, or I would go a day without any kind of writing. But now, my celebration is to turn on the camera and talk to my imaginary booktube friends at length. You poor things. Abarami says, forgive me if this is too weird. Are books ever better than food, as certain people claim on YouTube? It has been my experience that most of the people on YouTube who claim that books are better than food don't read. They just like the appurtenance. They like the act of like being considered a reader. The few who say that are obviously wrong. but most of the ones who say things like that, oh, books are life. Oh, they're my life. They're my whole life. Show me a little drone camera the size of a tiny thumb drive, and have that drone follow that person around in the course of 24 hours. Watch how much they read. Oh, books are my life. They're my whole life. I can't think of life without them. Okay. But my little drone footage says that it's now 5 days since you did any reading that wasn't scrolling on Instagram. 5 whole days. So, are you still alive? How much is this of life to you? Let's see here. Nose Army says, do you ever read any of your old book reviews? Have you ever regretted something that you wrote in one of them, whether it be poorly worded, inaccurate, or too mean? Maybe this is a silly question since you are infallible. Well, I am. I don't ever regret anything, but I do wish, when I reread an older review, like when I'm reformatting something, if I'm going to link to it here or somewhere else, I often wish that I had done more. I often feel like I'm not giving the book its full due. I think that's natural, especially when so much of the stuff that I'm linking is stuff that I wrote on a deadline for a publication that told me my word count. I think that's probably natural, and I often feel that. And lastly, we're at the end. Maximus Stedish says, does any of Roman Polanski's work have artistic merit in your eyes? What a way to end. Some. I don't see him as a genius. I've watched all of his mainstream stuff, and I just don't see it at all. The kinds of things that film buffs scream about in his work, I think seem so obvious. Oh, that is surely my cue to go. So I won't go on a long film rant. Instead, I'll just wrap up. But I can't end the Q&A without thanking you. I want to thank all of you again for this. This is so much fun. We will meet again at 12.3. Thank you, BookTube.